All right, so now we're going to talk about the rise of Muscovy. The first reference to Moscow in a written record dates from 1147, and it was a place where a prince, Yuri Dolgoruki, for the Russian students, Dolgoruki means long arms, Dolgi Ruki, long arms, Yuri Dolgoruki and Sviatoslav Olgovich met. At the time, it was just a minor town on the western border of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality. In 1156, Prince Yuri Dolgoruki fortified the town. He built a timber fence with a moat as a defense in the event that it was attacked. In the course of the Mongol invasion of Rus, the town was burnt to the ground and most of its inhabitants purportedly murdered. Now, this timber fort, na Moskvia, which meant on the Moscow River, was inherited, as I mentioned, by Danil, the youngest son of Alexander Nevsky, prince up there in Novgorod, which was developing a different tradition, a more oligarchic republican tradition than say was going on in Kiev. But his youngest son, he was able to bequeath to this small town, Moscow. His son Daniel, youngest son, gets this town, Moscow, in the 1260s. At the time, it was considered the least valuable of his father's possessions. And Daniel, he was still a child, and the fort was governed by deputies that were appointed by his uncle. He comes of age, and he ends up being a pretty successful ruler of this small town. He comes out on top in some power struggles with brothers. And from 1283, he acts as the ruler of an independent principality. So he gets the status of Muscovy to be kind of raised. And Daniel is considered the founder of the Danilovichy line. And what this means is that the princes of Moscow don't consider themselves to be part of that larger rotation system. And early on, no one wants Moscow anyway. It's like the bottom of the bucket. But gradually, it's going to emerge as the most successful city, the most successful principality. And what I want to do in this lecture is go through that story. Now, and answer the question, why Moscow? This is a nighttime map of Moscow right here, and you can just see it stretches outward and outward and outward through many. These are various highway rings, garden rings, and this is one of the first maps of Moscow. Actually, this is an early 17th century, so not quite the first, but an early map of Moscow, where this yellow highlighted part right here is the Kremlin, and which is sort of kind of right down in this city. And when this map was drawn, the whole of Moscow was maybe this far. I mean, it is hard for me to get my head around how much this city has grown. And our course, 16th, 17th century, it's pretty small. A place, and let me give you two examples. If you've ever been to Moscow and you've ridden on the Moscow metro, places like Kolomenskaya and there are a number of metro stops that are literally considered in the city center that in the time we're talking about were way out of town. And let me give you one example. And again, this is a 19th century example, but when Napoleon came to Moscow and conquered Moscow in 1812, when he was still on the outskirts of Moscow, he came to a woman's monastery, the Novodevichy monastery, and he desecrated that temple by bringing a horse into it, and he hung out there for a while. And in 1812, when Napoleon was there, the Novodevichy convent was considered outside of Moscow. If you go to Moscow now, the Novodevichy convent is 3 or 4 stops from the Moscow Kremlin. I mean, it is in the city. So I think it's remarkable to think about just how much the city has grown. And then even a contemporary note. So I worked in Moscow for a company from 1997 to 2000. And even since I left working there, Moscow has built kind of 2 additional city rings outside the city. The growth has been phenomenal. And even to this day, Moscow is sort of like the New York City, the Washington, D.C., and the Los Angeles all in one place. To be perfectly honest, it's a problem. You have it's kind of, it's the governmental center, the financial center, the entertainment and everything center. St. Petersburg is the next largest city in Russia, and it is something like half the size. And then the size of cities in Russia falls off precipitously. So Moscow is a city that, and this may be even dated, it has a daytime population. It has a daytime population on the order of 13 to 15 million people, and a sleeping population, it said, somewhere over 10 million people. And that means from the outskirts, people just take the trains into the metro, into the city center at a phenomenal rate. I'm going to tell you one little story that I just kind of blew my mind. When I was working there, I had a neighbor who had a dacha, and he and his mother invited me to their dacha, which you had to take the metro to the very end of the line and then get on an elektrichka, an electric train, and take it another couple of hours out to this small little village where they had a wonderful little home and garden with, no plumbing, some electricity, but no plumbing. And where people have a garden and spend their weekends to get some fresh air out of the city. Lots of people have dachas. So one thing that the Soviet system did was really distribute some little patch of land that could be your own outside the city, or sort of your own, issued to you. When I was on this visit, I met we visited this family, and the man, he commuted to Moscow every day of his life. It meant that he spent about 9 hours a day commuting, where he would meet some buddies, get on the electrichka, take like a between 2 and 3 hour train ride and then have over an hour to get to work, show up, do his job, and then do the same thing in the evening. So he would leave at about between 4 and 4:30 in the morning and get back between 10 and 10:30 at night. And he did that every single night for years and years on end, because they didn't have enough money to have an apartment in Moscow too. They just lived at the dacha. Meanwhile, get this, his wife had never in her life been to Moscow. They were so far away from Moscow that the next biggest town where she could, have a mall and get the types of any of the shopping that she needed to do was in the other direction. And so I just found it so mind-blowing that these 2 people that slept in the same bed every night, he worked in Moscow every single day. She'd never been there in her life. Anyway, so that's just kind of looking at this map reminds me of this story and just how huge Moscow is in Russian history. But anyway, so why did Moscow, that starts out in 1157 as a little nothing village, become the most major, powerful, and important city in Russia, the center of Russia? Well, and one thing I would say is, what you always say, right, when you ask about why does something succeed, and we say location, location, location. Oh wait, and I wanted to actually, this too, but should be a GIF, but it isn't playing. It's not that important. And so here we want to ask this question: why did Muscovy, the capital of which was at Moscow, emerge as the preeminent principality on the Pontic plain? And so if we say, location, 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 no, that doesn't get us there. If you look at this, we've looked at some maps, and we've established that one of the drives for activity in this part of the world is commercial trade, up here through the Baltics, down the Caspian, and down the Volga into the Black Sea, onto Constantinople. So to be on a trade route is advantageous. but there's no one single river that gets you there. You have to portage. And there's a variety of portages. So Moscow isn't, compared to Nizhny Novgorod or Yaroslavl or Ryazan, and even arguably Penza and certainly Tver, Moscow doesn't have any particular locational advantage. So location isn't really the reason. So what is the reason? Why among all these different principalities is it Moscow that isn't even, that is here? It was part of Vladimir Suzdal that ends up being the biggest deal of all. Well, before I say that, let me just say a couple of words about Vladimir Suzdal. So Vladimir Suzdal is this town to the north of Kiev. It's established by Vladimir Monomach, and it becomes the seat of the Metropolitan of Kiev in 1299. And importantly, one of the signs, remember when I talked about Kiev and I said, there's some historians have determined that Kiev's light was probably already fading before the Mongols attacked. And why do they think that? One of the reasons that they think that is that what the Grand Prince Andrei Bogolyubsky, who was the son of Yuri Dolgoruki, and a Kuman princess. So you had an Orthodox princess who married a nomad. Again, here's an example of interaction that if you were to read those chronicles that just talk about that awful Mongol yoke, you could miss. So Andrei Bogolyubsky, when he has a battle and he becomes Grand Prince, when he becomes Grand Prince, he decides, I'll pass moving back to Kiev. I kind of like it here. And instead, he institutes the building of some really beautiful churches that to this day stand, and religion is very important. And so it adds to the prestige of Vladimir. So not only does he pass on Kiev, which is sort of a sign that it's, best days may be behind it, he also ends up sending an army to sack Kiev and collect booty from it in 1169. So we see this kind of passing, and Vladimir Suzdal has this brief moment where it's the seat of the Metropolitanate and kind of the brightest city, but that too is going to pass through to Moscow. So why Moscow? The answers, I think, are these. The Yarlik. I talked to you, the Yarlik was the privilege to collect tribute for the Mongol Tsar, the Mongol Khans. And many of the principalities would have liked that duty. And there was a lot of, talk about inside baseball and some dramatic history. There's competition to deliver the Yarlik in these medieval centuries, but more often than not, the privilege goes to Moscow. And that ends up being hugely advantageous because what Moscow does is it collects a little bit more and it skims off the top, keeps some for itself, with which it can fortify its army, make itself more wealthy. And it also, all this can be super treacherous because the Han had a nose for BS. I'm improvising a little bit, but I think the sense is true enough that Moscow could say, hey, that city gave us a hard time about collecting the tribute this year. You might want to put them in their place, and the Han might organize an army and go sack them again, right? So as being the liaison for kind of the news and the status of the whole realm, Moscow, if things went right, if they didn't piss off the Han so that he just killed them there, as happened on certain occasions, it could be a tremendous advantage. And one of the first princes that historians note as doing this was Ivan Kalita, and who rules from 1325 to 1340. And Kalita is an old word for money bags. That he is, and he got that name because he was recognized for making Moscow wealthier. Another thing, centralizing strategies. I'll kind of say more about that, but that the Moscow princes attempt to kind of claim more control and be in charge over aspects of rule, if you will. It seems to have worked out well for them. They also will devote substantial resources into developing Moscow as a symbolic center. So they'll build big, beautiful churches there. They'll make it a place where it is worth having a pilgrimage to. They also do this other, and one way in which this plays out, and I think that in our kind of modern secular world, it can be a stretch for us to appreciate how important religion was in in daily life and in unifying, in creating a kind of unifying political allegiances, etc. The one things that the grand princes in Moscow would do is they would go out to a town and they would go to the most important church in that town, and they would take that icon and they would bring that icon back to Moscow, and they would have icon painters paint that icon, make a replica, and then that icon through a ritual ceremony would be installed in the iconostasis. I'll show you some pictures here of a church in Moscow, and then that a ritual would happen where that icon would be returned. And so then through this, and this would be carried out through rituals that people could witness, people that were part of the church and not part of the church, and the ritual would be witnessed by people, and it was a way of linking this symbolic center to this town. We are both worshiping before this icon, and now our special local icon has a place of honor in a big Moscow church. And so that was one of the ways in which the Danilovichy princes were conscious about creating Moscow as a symbolic center for all of the Rus principalities. And then luck was also very important in this. They had genetic good luck in that they had often they had enough sons so that the line didn't die out. You know, that's in history, families die out. They don't last forever. And so you had enough sons that they died out, and you also had not too many sons that you had a lot of violence. Although sometimes there was a degree of violent culling of brothers or uncles that might cause a problem. And so that's a pretty that's forced luck. That's not just chance in those cases. But so for whatever reason, the Danilovichy line is this line that always has a capable son to step in and continuing things, strong enough that he doesn't look like a easy target to outsiders that might have regional aspirations as well. And so for all these reasons, Muscovy gradually emerges as the most prestigious, the most wealthy, and the first among many cities in the Rus principalities. Now, Moscow's rise and the Mongol horde's decline, I think, are like ships passing in the night. As one is on the way up, the other is on the way down. But this doesn't happen instantly at all. It actually takes a century. And here, there's just a couple of pictures to highlight for you some of the risks of bringing the Yarlik. Prince Mikhail of Tver, so in a moment when Tver, a neighboring city, if you're ever in Moscow, Main Street now in Moscow, that kind of this commercial boulevard that leads right down to the Kremlin is called Tverskaya. Just recently on YouTube, I've been looking at all these thousands of people out in the street to protest the arrest of Alexander Navalny on Tverskaya, a street I've walked many, many times. Tverskaya leads north to Tver. So in the 12th, at the end of the 13th century, 14th century, Tver had the Yarlik a bit too. And on one incident, Prince Mikhail goes down to Tver to deliver the tribute, and he ends up getting executed by the Khan. And he was executed by the Khan when Prince Yuri Dolgoruki, who married the Khan Uzbek's sister, or no, maybe not Dolgoruki, but Prince Yuri marries Khan Uzbek's sister, and she dies when she was in the custody of Prince Mikhail. And maybe there was foul play, we don't know, but it's said that someone from Moscow doing Yuri's bidding whispered in the Khan's ear that there had been foul play. And so when Mikhail showed up, he got curtains for Mikhail. And that wasn't the only time that happened. Actually, a different Prince Mikhail, this time from Chernigov earlier in the century, had also displeased the Khan, shows up with the tribute to deliver to the Khan, and boom, he got executed as well. So it was advantageous if it went well. Delivering the Yarluk could also be quite fraught. Now, and actually this was, I wanted to just kind of make this point again to maybe complicate these ideas of unified, solid trends in historical development, that Galicia and Volhynia, they made different and separate deals with the Mongols and included contributing troops for the invasion of Europe quite early on. Of course, that isn't necessarily so telling, because that's one of the things that the Mongols did. They made the different principalities in addition to giving tribute, they sometimes had them also pony up warriors for their various campaigns. Now, so I said that kind of Moscow's rise and the Mongol demise are like ships passing in the night. And so now this is a lot of text right here, but I want to put some events on your timeline to tell this story of Moscow getting out from underneath the Mongol yoke. And I think it's a story that we can date pretty much over the course of a century, from about 1380 to 1480. Now, I think at no moment leading up to 1480 would you have many people saying, oh, Moscow, it doesn't take orders from those Mongols anymore, even though some might have thought it quietly. But after 1480, it's pretty clear. And so why do the Mongols get weaker? Well, as I said, it's born out of a tradition of not kind of centralized stationary rule anyway. So it would almost be more surprising that there was so much staying power. But that said, Timur Lane was substantial in kind of weakening Mongol power when he sought to reassert a kind of Mongol empire that was already fragmented. In 1391, he'd invaded the Eurasian steppes and defeated the Golden Rule Han. He ravaged the Caucasus and southern Russia in 1395. His empire didn't last long. It disintegrated after 1405, but he helped damage the Kipchak Khanate. And his and so then the Nogais had also challenged Genghis Khan. So who are the Nogais? The Nogais are these are a type of nomad that were, the way I would put it is that they had a substantial enough sense of self and sense of history that they did subordinate to Genghis Khan. They joined his armies and reaped the benefits of being subordinate to him, but subsequently weren't, they had a distinct enough sense of self-identity that they, with less charismatic, perhaps, leadership, kind of sought to reestablish their own way of doing things. And so they offered some challenges as well. Now, the first kind of moment, though, so there's some of these things in the background that contribute to the Mongols on their own being weakened. But let's talk about now their confrontations with Russia. And there I sort of put it in this century of 1380 to 1480. So in 1380, Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry of the Don, has a battle at a place called Kulikovo Polya, Kulikova Field on the Don River, which is how he gets his name, Dmitry Donskoy. And in this battle, the Mongols, here is a very old rendition of the battle, and there's accounts written from it. And actually, a couple years ago, the BBC News even cited this battle as an example of Maskirova and kind of sly Russian battlefield tactics. So it's one more I'm always keeping my eyes out for ways in which Russian history is marshaled in the Western press. And so the 1380 Battle of Kulikovo Field was marshaled. Now, the Russians won in this battle. And so this is a surprise. No one, people didn't really quite see that coming. Although Dmitry wouldn't have fielded an army against them if he didn't think he had a chance. But the Mongols didn't take it so easily. They in 1382 they sacked Moscow viciously, killed lots of people, took lots of booty, as a way of really reasserting their suzerainty over Moscow. So they weren't going down without a fight. What else happened? But nonetheless, the Golden Horde has its problems, and it fragments into a variety. In 1430, the Crimean Khanate forms. And actually, the Crimean Khanate is going to be the longest lasting kind of Chinggisid descendant. And you have Chinggisids that are ruling the Crimean Khanate until Crimea is annexed by the Russian Empire in 1783 under Catherine the Great. You have in 1436, the Khanate of Kazan is formed. In 1466, the Khanate of Astrakhan is formed. Moscow is going to very gradually, Crimea being last, but Kazan and Astrakhan, it's going to conquer both of those places, indicative of its rise. Then, so what's something else that happens? Another sign along the way that historians look back and say, whoa, that shows that the Mongols aren't totally in control anymore. In 1446, under Vasily II, the Grand Prince Vasily II, he creates the Khanate of Kasimov in his own Muscovite realm. Basically, what happens is some Tatar descent, some Mongols come to him and they say, we want out of that Mongol arrangement. Like, can we serve you instead, Prince Vasily? And Prince Vasily says, why, yes, you certainly can. And as a matter of fact, I'll even give you this territory. It's yours. And he carves out this territory for these Muslim Mongol princes called the Khanate of Kasimov. And the Kasimov princes are, they have their own territory, but they're welcome. They could go to Moscow. They're honored people of the court. And so in some ways, that's some things within the Mongol house itself, more indications that they're fraying, that these Mongol high ups within the Mongol Khanate, they think that putting their, betting their horses on Moscow is a better deal for themselves. And they go over to Vasily, who welcomes them with open arms. In 1448, here's another big moment. Vasily II names his son Ivan III, and Ivan III is going to be a big deal for us. Ivan III, he names him his successor without permission from the Khan at Sarai. This is a big deal because along with the Yarlik, another way in which the Mongols, they outsource their suzerainty, but another way in which they maintain it is they say the Khan gets to decide who's going to be the next ruler. And they didn't really interfere. Pretty much the Grand Prince would come and say, I want this person next, and it was kind of just rubber stamped. But that formality was still an indication of Moscow's subordinate status. Vasily II decides, I don't need their permission, I'm just doing it, and he does. We also know that from 1420 to 1480, Moscow didn't pay tribute every year. We don't have the exact numbers, but we know that they're already we don't even need to go down there and necessarily give them tribute every year. And then where the Mongols actually launch unsuccessful campaigns against Moscow in 1451, 1455, 1461. Again, they're not passing on the tribute without giving a fight. And then finally, the moment when historians can agree that it is all over is known as the stand on the Ugra. And they say stand on the Ugra because it isn't even really a battle. It happens in 1480, and these two armies beat each other on the Ugra River. And they, evidently, Khan Ahmad had made an agreement with the Lithuanians, who also don't like to see an expansionist Moscow. So he's waiting for this Muslim Khan is waiting for his Christian allies to come help fight the Orthodox Muscovites with him, but the Lithuanians don't show. And so Ahmad doesn't even engage. And that is pretty much it, and it goes out with a fizzle. And so that's pretty much how we say that, you know, from 1380 to 1480, we have this long drawn out period where Muscovy's on the rise and Mongol authority is declining in the region until by 1480, we can definitely say for sure, yep, they are their own deal. Here is an iconic representation of Vasily II, who rules from 1425 to 1462. And he was known as Vasily the Dark, meaning the world for him was dark because he was blind. And he was blind because in back to this sort of Muscovite politics and succession politics, there's essentially a civil war that is going on from about 1433 to 1453, where various, even of the Danilovichy line princes, are vying for leadership. And in the context of this, Vasily is kidnapped and blinded. Blinding one's ruler was kind of a punishment that we often see. He was blinded, but he was ransomed. And by the way, his ransom, the Stroganovs, maybe you've heard beef stroganoff. The Stroganovs are really important merchants in Russian history. This is the first moment I'm aware of that the Stroganovs appear on the radar screen. They were like salt merchants that ponied up some money for the ransom of Vasily II, and this earned them a privileged place at court, which they will maintain for the rest of the Russian Empire. So they played that well. So he's rescued and he regains power and continues to rule, which for me is a pretty remarkable thing in a world where rulers do and are expected to go into battle and fight in battle. To be able to maintain leadership without the benefit of sight, I think is a remarkable thing in history. So that's something I want you to know about Vasily II. Emerges amidst this civil war, still emerges on top. It's on his watch that the Khanate of Kasimov is established, and it's over. Here is a mosque built in the 1400s. So probably not even the first mosque built on Russian territory, because you had those Volga Bulgars who were Muslims over on the Volga. But this one still stands, built in the 1400s in the Khanate of Kasimov. They were granted their principality, on which they built a mosque and became honored courtiers in the kingdom of Muscovy. And then he also names his own son as co-ruler before successor. And then just something to keep your eye out, like the bigger global picture, 1453, big date when Constantinople falls to the Turks. There's a lot of ripples from that. In 1354, Moscow had officially become the seat of the metropolitan, right? It had gone from Kiev to Vladimir, and now it passes to Moscow, another sign of how Moscow's stock is rising. In 1439, so on Vasily II's watch, there is a Council of Florence, and it kind of I think the meetings might have lasted from 1439, 1440, 41. And this is, remember back to our church schism, the Latin church in Rome and the Eastern church in Constantinople, there were many people who had visions. They thought that Christianity should be united in one Christendom, and it was their aim to reunite the churches. And at this Council of Florence, the bishops got together and they charted out a pathway to reunification for the churches. Well, the representative from Moscow, Sylvester, he returned and he said, "Hey, I've got good news. We have a plan to reunite the church." And they said, "What? You didn't do your duty." And he was thrown in jail, which was kind of a bit of an indication of how non-receptive leadership in Moscow was at that moment to a reunification of the churches. The Russian bishops got together and formally condemned that union in 1443. I'm not sure how long Sylvester stayed in jail. Now, let's see, so kind of moving on this story. Now we have not too many more minutes. Ivan III is the son of Vasily III, and he really goes down in history as now kind of a ruler that left his mark. He's born around 1440, and he rules from 1462 to 1505. Having a long reign is, often a good thing for stability, etc. And on his watch, he gains a whole bunch of territory. He gains Yaroslavl and Rostov and Novgorod and Tver and Vyatka. So when I say gains, what do I mean? All these towns are essentially different separate kingdoms, autonomous kingdoms. And now what he's doing is having all of these princes say, we answer to you, Tsar. You can, your authority extends here to our territory. Now, one of the things that happens, and here's, I'm going to introduce these two terms and make a distinction. I want you to have a distinction between the term prince and boyar. Boyars are the retinue of the grand prince. These are, when he needs to go out on command, he calls up his closest boyars, and one is going to be like the front flank, the right flank, the left flank, and those boyars are going to call up their servitors or people indebted to them, or the retinue that they support. And in this place, pay attention to those pictures in Herberstein. He shows you what people look like going into war. It's on big war horses, and they're carrying pikes and a lot of armor. And this, you don't have big armies. We haven't had we're way short of the military revolution. Pretty small armies, but they're well, actually, I shouldn't have said maybe that, but we haven't had the military revolution yet. So the armies aren't so huge. And so those boyars are kind of close, high-ranking families around the Grand Prince. And then princes emerge as a slightly separate status. And when these historic principalities became subordinated to Moscow, in many cases, they had a title of, rather than prince, boyar. Rather than boyar, prince. And it was a kind of promised eternal-ish status for them. And that was part of the way Ivan worked. He had, in terms of how did Ivan build his territory? What were his strategies for creating empire? He used a bunch of them. He used warfare. And Novgorod, he hammered. He had to do it twice because they had a Republican tradition and didn't want to be subordinate to Moscow. But two campaigns against them in 1471 and 1477 did the trick. He also he would use coercion, and so it's kind of making people an offer they couldn't refuse. Like in some cases, he said, "You can be autonomous, but what I want you to do is in your will just write that your kingdom is coming over to me, and I promise your children will be honored princes at court for all eternity." And for many principalities, that worked well enough. So that was kind of one of the ways that he would coerce through succession, if not warfare, driving a hard bargain. Ivan raises his stature, and he was also very involved and very attentive to the importance of rituals. He would visit all the cities in his realm. He would honor those regional icons. One of the first papers that I wrote in graduate school was about an explorer from Venice named Contarini, who goes to Muscovy. He is going to Persia, and he's crossing the Caspian Sea, and he gets kidnapped. And so he's a hostage by these kidnappers on the Caspian. And then these Russian merchants buy him out of ransom. And he's like, "Thank you very much." And they said, "It's not free. You have to pay us back." He says, "I don't have any money." And they say, "All right, you're going to Moscow. We'll send a messenger. You tell them to bring the funds." And so this guy Contarini gets sent up to Moscow, in 76, 77, and he's waiting for people from Venice to come and pay his ransom bill to these Russian merchants that had done him such a favor. And he writes in his account how Ivan isn't in Moscow because he's traveling around the realm, kind of doing that work, that political work of maintaining good relations. And then the other thing that Ivan does, and I'll wrap up with Ivan III today. The other thing that Ivan does is to raise status, is he raises the international status by marrying Sofia Paleologia, who is a ward of the Pope and a niece of the Byzantine emperor. And so that is like a really big coup for Russia in terms of its international status, kind of putting Russia on the map of Christendom in a new way. And in some of so Ivan III, he still is called Grand Prince almost all the time, but there are a few correspondence where he sends letters in which he calls himself the Tsar. So Ivan III is actually the first Russian ruler I am aware of that uses the title Tsar, but the first person that uses it consistently and all the time is going to be Ivan IV. Now, and so so he's attentive to the symbols, the titles of rulership. Through marriage, he has this wonderful coup. He also adopts the double-headed eagle symbol, totally not original. I mean, the Habsburgs and a bunch of other ruling houses also do it, but he adopts the double-headed eagle for Russia. And so he's expanding territory, militarily if he needs to, diplomatically if he can, and he's also doing all these things to make Muscovy a more robust state. Here is actually Novgorod, which had, DMR brought it up the other day, that the Saint Sophia, like Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, kind of replicated in Kiev and in Novgorod as well. So Novgorod, I haven't talked too much about it. The first city the Ruhr kids went to. Over the years, Novgorod, up there closer to the Baltics, closer to the north, closer to Western Europe, develops a sort of Republican tradition. Don't get too rosy-eyed about this. This is a Republican tradition in which the oligarchs have a say, but nonetheless, they had a say and a sense of an autonomy and a politics that gets worked out through meetings of the Vichy, which sort of, the kind of institution that came together and met it. And whenever the Vichy would meet, they would ring the Vichy bell. And kind of that ever attentive to symbols and rituals, one of the things that Ivan III did was he took that bell and he brought it back to Moscow and he melted it down. And I don't know if he poured it into a cannon or what, but he really showed those Novgorodians that their tradition, like, sayonara to your traditions. You've been such a problem. You are now under Moscow's watch. Also, what Ivan did when Sofia Paleologia came to Moscow, she brought with her a bunch of Italians that introduced aquavita, also known as vodka, into Russia, and Italian architects that built the Kremlin churches. How nice that those atheist Soviets didn't raze them to the ground, that built the Kremlin churches that to this day stand within the Kremlin walls. So this is the walls of Kremlin. This is the outer wall of the Kremlin. This is a government building. And then beyond that, you see the Kremlin churches. Here's the Cathedral of the Dormition. We could spend a lot of time looking at churches. Here's a view from the Muscovy River. This is, is it now called the Presidential Palace again? Where Putin does his government work. Tourists can go in through the Kremlin. It's high security area, but there's a fantastic museum. If you can ever go to Moscow, do make sure that you visit the armory. The museum ticket's pretty expensive, but you see so much material culture from the plateware and the jeweled attack that they put on their horses and gifts that were exchanged between other Eurasian rulers and rulers to the West and the czars over the centuries. It's really, I'm biased, but a fantastic museum. And this, let me just show you a picture of inside one of the churches inside the Kremlin. And so one of the things, I mean, if you are of a Puritan tradition, you never see churches like this, because one of the things the Protestant Reformation was all about was stripping away all that ritual and mysticism, et cetera, and just having quiet, clean churches. Very unlike the Catholic tradition. And nowadays, post-Vatican II, Catholic churches don't even look so much, don't resemble this, but Orthodox churches are kind of teeming with color and images. There are exceptions, but as a rule, and certainly these churches are, where there's there's a 5-tiered iconostasis of various saints and important biblical moments. Some of them are standard, and depending on the saint of that church, the iconostasis can be different. The Orthodox service is quite different and long. And when we talk about reforms later, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And here is just a picture of the churches of Vladimir. One thing, kind of a cultural moment I wanted to point out to you, if you ever go to Russia, you can go to Kizhi and you can visit where they have summer and winter churches, which is something they actually did. They would build two. And the reason they would build two is that the winter churches, they would cram everyone in and they were easier to heat. And then in the summer, you would have a little bit more space. But this was, it wasn't everywhere, but there was this tradition of having a different separate structure for your summer and your winter churches. My understanding is driven by heating needs. Here is actually we'll hold off on that. And then this is just a couple more moments in that Orthodox thread that we've been following. Here's the picture of the double eagle that Ivan III takes on as a symbol of Russia. And with that, we'll wrap up our talk on Muscovy's rise.